And in a strained context marked by polarization, legal setbacks, the aftermath of COVID-19, economic recession, and social divisions, U.S. midterm elections are underway. To go on the matter, we receive Teri Mattson, political analyst and podcaster. We welcome Teri.
Good morning. Nice to be with you on the election day in the United States. So I want to share with something. You said something in the opening of your program this morning that the House and Senate in the United States control the political agenda, which is saying the White House does not. And I think that's really, really clear, because when we vote in the United States, we tend to think changing the president is going to change the political agenda. And that is not the case. The president does not run the country unless you have what Dick Cheney referred to as an executive presidency, where a lot of legislation is done via executive order, bypassing the House and the Senate, bypassing Congress. So that's a really important thing that you mentioned in the opening of your program. I also want to share with your viewers that this is the headline I woke up to this morning regarding elections in the United States. High economic dissatisfaction among US voters could mean problems for Democrats. Nothing about the war in Ukraine. It's really, really important to understand the social media narrative, specifically social media, but the mainstream media narrative in the US has been about economics. Particularly, there's been a campaign about explaining the word inflation to US voters, which is insulting to people, to US citizens. I think most understand the word, but there's been a huge campaign to explain inflation. There has been no campaign really to explain the effects of the war in Ukraine on US citizens. And that is really, really fascinating, because that war has been a complete disaster for the president and his party. And that is why, in part, why the inflation is so bad in the country. But there's no link between the two in the campaign narrative right now. It's all about economics, inflation, and nothing about explaining the war in Ukraine, nothing about explaining economic war specifically against Russia and 39 other countries around the world as part of the inflationary problem. So it's a big day today, big day. I'm not sure how big of a change it's going to mean in U.S.
Well,
US policy.
that's really interesting of you to say. You don't know how big is going to be the shifting between the powers and maybe the changes in the U.S. because of these elections. But let's go to some of the topics today. Teri, ahead of these elections, the Republicans reinforced their MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, as you remember, and also called even a precinct of members of committees. They wanted the people to take little posts to maybe be vigilant about this notion that the elections were stolen, and the Democrats, on the other hand, they have been telling that democracy is at risk. That's the premise in these elections. And also they have been saying that the abortion rights must be retaken, that some of the legal setbacks under Biden's administration must be retaken. So this is maybe the tokens of each side, but at the bottom line, the US citizens and the local politics is what is going to be impacted because of this. What is at stake with these elections for the people?
Well, I would argue that, the Democrats are saying democracy is at stake. And I'm wondering, it's fascinating how the Democrats define democracy. I would argue there really isn't much, at least not as far as electoral democracy. I mean, case in point, there's two major parties that really are funded and elevated in the US media. For example, last night in the Los Angeles Times, the publication was discussing what all the major candidates in races throughout the state of California, where I'm from, but also throughout the nation in general. And all the candidates that were discussed are either registered and running as Republicans and or as Democrats. No mention of any third-party candidates, such as Matthew Hoh, who is running for Senate in North Carolina. He actually had to fight to get on the ballot in North Carolina. The Democratic Party tried to obstruct his participation in the elections today. So it's ironic that the Democrats are running on, preserving democracy when they themselves do not recognize or want to compete against third-party candidates. And he, by the way, is a U.S. veteran. He served in the Iraq War. The other thing is the majority of U.S. voters are registered as independent. They are not registered as Republicans or Democrats. So there's this big, demographic of voters who are not relating to either party. My feeling is, myself included, we don't relate to either party because they're both the same. Fundamentally, both parties are the same. I think a lot of your viewers have probably seen that social media meme, two wings of the same bird. And fundamentally, that's the case, particularly if you look at foreign policy since the Democrats took power in November of 2020. It hasn't changed. And I think those of you in Cuba and Venezuela can most definitely attest to that the foreign policy, particularly the economic warfare imposed on both of those countries and many others, is the same strategy that was expanded under the Trump administration and has not been alleviated at all under the Biden administration. So I'm not sure what democracy means at this point in time to either party. Regarding abortion rights, the Democrats have been in power, particularly when Barack Obama was president. His first term, controlled the White House, controlled the Senate, controlled the House. That was the moment to codify, to legalize, to make abortion legal and available by law in the United States. They did not grab that opportunity to do so. So I would argue it's not an issue for the Democratic Party. It is what we call in the States a wedge issue. It is something that motivates a lot of emotional voter response. But when you really analyze what has happened, nothing has happened. Whether it's Republicans in office nor Democrats, as we saw during the first Obama presidency, and nothing has happened since with the Democrats. So to me, that's an emotional wedge issue and not really taken seriously among the Democratic Party.
Teri, I coincide with you. Under Biden and under Trump, the policies towards Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela have been the same. But something is happening in the rest of the Americas, and now we are going to your area of expertise. Because as you know, there is a shift of power in Latin America as many progressive forces are retaking power in Brazil, maybe. As you know, recently Lula da Silva has been named the president of Brazil, also in Colombia, in Chile, and several other governments. How these changes in the political landscape in Latin America, comes to play with the U.S. midterm elections and the policies and vice versa?
Well, I will say in general, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so thankful to have a platform for my particular talk show about Latin America. In the States, we don't know enough about foreign policy in general as individual citizens. We don't talk about foreign policy enough. Certainly not the way those of you in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and countries throughout the world understand your own country's relationship to the rest of the world and how U.S. foreign economic and military policy affects the globe. But with that said, it is really, really encouraging, hopeful, even I would even say exciting to see what is unfolding throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. I will share with your audience that I was very, very fortunate to have been invited as an international election observer to 8 countries. As your viewers know, there were, starting in October of 2020 in Bolivia and all the way through 2021 and into Colombia, and most recently Brazil, presidential and legislative elections throughout the Americas. I was invited to 8 countries to observe elections. And I will say the 3 things that were prominent, prevalent, or common, is probably the better word, results from all of those elections. And I would say even Colombia and Brazil, Colombia this summer and Brazil a couple weeks ago. People voted in those nations for national sovereignty, which is a pushback to US interventionism. They voted for natural resource sovereignty, which includes lithium, oil, gold, and also the Amazon. And they voted for governments that were campaigning to provide an economy beneficial to the majority of citizens. Now, those economic plans, were anything from like one step to the left of center, being more like a social democratic government with managing a capitalist system, to revolutionary economic policies. But to me, in my observations, those are the things that people have voted for in the last 16, 18 months that is clearly unfolding in presidential leadership throughout the Americas. One of the biggest things that happened in the Americas last year, September of last year, was the reconvening of CELAC here in Mexico City by López Obrador, the president of Mexico, and really promoting and building Latin America integration. And that was clearly supported by even right-wing governments such as Lasso in Ecuador. So there is an integration, being developed, being envisioned, and clearly unfolding. And how much of that integration the U.S. Will be part of is to be seen. It's going to mean a change in U.S. policy towards the region. I believe there are governments such as that here in Mexico that would like the integration of the Americas to include the United States. But that is going to definitely mean a new approach by the US. And it cannot be unilateral US only. It has to be recognizing the national sovereignty of all countries in the Americas. And it has to mean creating a table for all nations to come to as equals, not as vassals of the United States, not as puppets of the United States, but as equals. I don't know that that's possible, but what the Latin America and Caribbean countries are envisioning and building for themselves is really, really important and I think very, very exciting. Very exciting what's unfolding.
Thank you, Teri, for your time and your opinions hearing from the South. Time is against us, but we are so glad to receive you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join you.
Okay, so that was Teri, and she gave us her outlook and her take on the U.S. midterm election.